Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be diving deep into this topic that's, I don't know about you, but I find it fascinating and maybe like a little unsettling, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Media bias.
Yeah.
Like you've definitely heard people complaining about it like it's everywhere, right?
Well, yeah, all the time.
But we want to go a little deeper, like past the complaining and see what the research really says. We've got some excerpts here from this Knowable magazine interview with, let me make sure I get his name right, David Stromberg. He's a political economist, so that's like right up our alley.
Yeah, perfect.
So let's get into it.
You know what I think is really interesting, like how this whole field of study, like media bias research, really like took off in the 1930s.
Oh, okay. So like right when fascism was on the rise in Europe.
Exactly. It was the, like the golden age of radio, and suddenly everyone was like super worried about propaganda, right? The potential for mass brainwashing.
Right.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Like, could radio propaganda actually shift voters' opinions?
Yeah, and what's crazy is what the early researchers actually found. It turned out people's political opinions rarely actually changed based on, the media they consumed.
Really? Okay, so like no mass mind control through radio waves. Interesting. But why not? Were people just like tuning out anything that didn't already fit their worldview?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of it. People tend to like gravitate towards media that already aligns with what they already believe, But I think this also highlights like a key point about how economists define this, like damaging bias.
Okay, yeah, I'm listening.
It's not just about like having an ideological slant, like a conservative newspaper endorsing a Republican candidate. It's more about like actively misrepresenting the facts, suppressing information, or like straight up lying.
Gotcha. So more like fake news, not just like, the newspaper kind of leaning in a particular direction.
Yeah, exactly. And that distinction, it's super important.
Okay, distinction noted. But okay, let's like address the elephant in the room, especially here in the U.S. There's this like constant buzz about increasing polarization in the media. Is it really as bad as some people say?
Well, Stromberg's research suggests that while polarization definitely exists, U.S. media, on average, it remains relatively centrist. Even with journalists, leaning left personally.
Wait, hold on. Journalists leaning left. Like, how much are we talking here? And does that like bleed into their reporting?
So one study found that four times as many journalists identified as liberal compared to conservative.
Wow. That's a pretty big difference.
Okay.
But if the overall media output is more balanced, how do researchers actually measure that? Because it seems kind of subjective.
No, it's actually like more quantifiable than you might think. So researchers, they look at things like, okay, which candidates do newspapers endorse? Which policy proposals do they support? What kind of think tanks do they cite? Then they compare that data to the stances of like, members of Congress, even Supreme Court justices, to see where a media outlet falls on the political spectrum.
Right. So they're not just like going with their gut or anecdotal evidence. It's much more data driven.
Okay.
So is this whole, relatively centrist U.S. media, is that like a new thing?
It's actually a pretty big shift from the past. Go back to like the late 1800s in the U.S., most newspapers, they just openly declared their party affiliation, right? Their content was way more biased, much more overt.
So you pick up a paper and it would literally say, like, the Daily Republican, right on the masthead, like no pretense of objectivity at all.
Yeah, exactly. But things started to change, like around the turn of the 20th century. You saw fewer newspapers clinging to those explicit party ties.
Interesting. What prompted that shift? Was it like some kind of journalistic awakening, this realization that, objectivity is actually important?
I think it was probably more pragmatic than that. The rise of advertising and, increased competition definitely played a huge role. Newspapers became businesses, and to survive, they needed to appeal to a wider audience.
So it became less about like pushing a specific party line and more about attracting readers, whatever their political leanings.
Exactly. And that's actually a big contrast with European media. Open political affiliations are still super common there. You pick up a paper, you know exactly what party's viewpoint it represents.
Wow, that's really different. Makes you wonder, like, which approach is more effective? Or even, like, more honest, Okay, but let's kind of shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about the impact of all this bias. Let's say a news outlet is heavily slanted, right? How much power does it actually have to, like, change people's opinions? Like, does it actually change minds?
That's like the million-dollar question, right? It's something researchers have been trying to figure out for decades. And you know what? The consistent finding is it's actually really hard to change people's core political beliefs through the media alone.
Really? Why is that? Is it just like stubbornness? Or is there something else going on? Because, I mean, it feels like we're constantly bombarded with messages trying to like influence our thinking.
Yeah, there are definitely a few things happening there. First, people tend to avoid media that challenges their, their worldview. They go towards things that confirm what they already think.
Right.
And even if they do come across opposing viewpoints, you know what they do. They usually dismiss them.
Well,
Or they interpret them in a way that reinforces what they already believe. It's like this built-in defense mechanism, right?
right. To avoid that cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, that uncomfortable feeling when your beliefs are challenged.
Totally. So it's not just about what information is out there. It's also about how we filter it, how we process it. And if we're already convinced of something, it's really hard to break through that.
Yeah.
But okay, here's where things get kind of interesting. Stromberg actually suggests that, like, seeking out media that aligns with your views might actually be beneficial for voters, at least in some ways.
That's right. The logic is, like, a media source that actually shares your preferences, it can help you avoid voting for candidates who don't align with, with your interests. It's kind of like a filter, making sure you're getting the information that actually helps you make decisions that line up with, with your values.
This is like having a friend who, like, pre-screens all the political news and just gives you the stuff you need to make a decision that, like, reflects your beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but doesn't that just make echo chambers worse and, like, fuel more polarization?
Yeah, that's definitely the potential downside. When we only consume stuff that reinforces our existing beliefs, it's easy to get isolated in our own little bubbles.
Right, ideological bubbles.
Yeah, and that can be bad news for, a healthy democracy.
Yeah, because then you're not just missing out on alternative viewpoints, you're also missing out on the chance to, like, refine your own thinking, to actually debate things.
Yeah.
And that could lead to
A much more polarized electorate. And when voters are just, like, fixated on this idea of ideological purity, they become less responsive to, really crucial nonpartisan issues like corruption or how effective the government actually is, even like basic competence.
So it becomes less about governing effectively and more about, like, winning the culture war, whatever the cost.
Exactly. And that can create a ton of problems down the road.
Okay, so we've talked about how bias might not be as influential as we think in, like, actually shaping individual opinions, at least in democracies with, pretty diverse media landscapes. But when does bias actually become, like, harmful? When do we actually see real damage being done?
Well, I think some of the clearest examples come from, like totalitarian regimes, where control over the media is used to spread propaganda and incite violence. The Rwandan genocide in the 1990s is a chilling example.
Right. Radio played a huge role in that conflict, spreading hate speech and, like, dehumanizing entire groups of people.
Absolutely. Researchers actually found a correlation between areas with better radio reception and, get this, increased civilian deaths during the genocide. It's like a stark reminder of how media can be weaponized,
Right.
when it's in the wrong hands. And it's not just, a historical example either. There was this study on Nazi Germany that found a link between areas with more Nazi radio control and, guess what? Increased support for anti-Semitic policies during World War II.
It's kind of terrifying to think about how media can be used to, like, manipulate people on such a huge scale. But what about in more democratic societies where there's at least, like, a semblance of a free press? Are there examples of media bias causing harm, even when there's supposed to be freedom of information?
Oh, absolutely. The Iraq War is a good example. A lot of the U.S. media, they just, like, uncritically repeated the government's claims about weapons of mass destruction, in the lead up to the invasion. Even outlets like the New York Times, they issued apologies later for their reporting.
It's a good reminder that even in democracies, media bias can have big consequences. But you mentioned earlier that it's not always about outright lies or, misinformation. It could be more subtle than that.
Yeah, for sure. In democracies, bias often works by shaping which issues politicians actually prioritize. The media plays a huge role in setting the agenda, deciding what gets talked about and what just gets ignored.
So even if they're not, like, explicitly pushing a certain ideology, they're still influencing things by choosing what to cover and how to cover it.
Exactly. They hold the spotlight and politicians go where the attention is.
That's such a good point. And that actually brings us to something really important for you, the listener. Think about what makes headlines versus what actually impacts your daily life. Like plane crashes, celebrity scandals, that stuff grabs our attention. But it's not really that important in the grand scheme of things, compared to, like, poverty, climate change, systemic inequality.
Mm.
That stuff doesn't always make for the most exciting news, though.
Right, and that disconnect between what's newsworthy and what's actually important, it can have serious consequences. So I guess the question is, what can we do about it? If we're concerned about bias, how do we navigate this whole media landscape and make good decisions about where we're getting our information?
That is the question. And I think that's actually the perfect place to, jump into the next part of our deep dive. We're going to explore some actual strategies for becoming better, more discerning consumers of information and taking back some of our agency in the face of media bias. So stay tuned.
So, picking up where we left off, I think it's interesting how social media has added this whole other layer to this media bias thing,
Yeah, totally. On the one hand, it's given us access to way more voices, way more perspectives than ever before, right?
Oh, for sure. It's like this massive global town square where anyone can share their thoughts, connect with people who share their interests, all without the traditional gatekeepers.
Right, right. No more editors or producers deciding what we see and hear.
Yeah.
Which is pretty amazing when you think about it.
Totally. But okay, so that lack of traditional gatekeeping, it's not all sunshine and roses.
Right, there's got to be a downside.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's created this breeding ground for these echo chambers, and the spread of misinformation because as we talked about before, those algorithms, they're not really designed to keep us informed, are they?
No, they just want to keep us scrolling, keep us clicking, right?
Yeah, exactly. And they often end up prioritizing content that's emotionally charged, even if it's not accurate.
It's like they're feeding us outrage.
Right.
Because outrage gets clicks. So we end up in these digital rabbit holes where we're just surrounded by information that confirms our biases, even if those biases are based on bad information.
That's a great way to put it. It's like a personalized outrage machine, right? Just pumping us full of anger and affirmation. And the more time we spend in those echo chambers, the harder it is to get out and actually engage with different perspectives. We end up seeing the world through this super narrow lens, and anything that challenges that worldview is automatically oh, that's fake news or that's propaganda.
Right. It's like those early studies we talked about where people just stuck to their partisan newspapers. But now it's way more insidious because it's so personalized.
Yeah.
And it's everywhere. Our social media feeds become these custom-tailored echo chambers.
Exactly. Which, that has some pretty scary implications for how we actually function as a society, right?
Yeah. If we can't even agree on basic facts, or have civil conversations, how are we going to solve the big problems? I mean, climate change, economic inequality, political polarization, all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It requires us to actually work together to consider different viewpoints.
Absolutely. It's we're all speaking different languages, shouting at each other across these huge ideological divides instead of actually listening to each other.
Yeah, and like you were saying earlier, that kind of division and distrust, it just makes things worse.
Oh, yeah. It totally plays into the hands of the people who want to exploit our differences, for their own benefit. It makes us weaker, less able to solve problems together. And it undermines, the whole foundation of a healthy democracy. So, I mean, I guess the big question is, what can we actually do about it? Is it enough to just be aware of this stuff? Or are there things we can actually do to, push back against the echo chambers and misinformation?
Right. Awareness is great, but it doesn't feel like enough. Is there something more we can do, both individually and as, a society?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, first and foremost, we need to get better at media literacy, right?
Mm-hmm.
For ourselves and especially for future generations.
Yeah, we need to teach kids how to think critically about information.
Totally. How to evaluate sources, spot bias, recognize misinformation, and how to, engage with different viewpoints in a way that's thoughtful and respectful.
So it's not just about telling them what to think, but how to think. Give them the tools to figure things out for themselves.
Exactly. And we can't just tell them to do it. We have to show them how it's done. Be good role models,
Yeah.
Demonstrate critical thinking ourselves, have those respectful conversations, even, or maybe especially, when we disagree with someone.
Yeah. Lead by example. Show them it's possible to disagree without being, a jerk about it.
For sure. And I think recognizing that we all have biases, but that doesn't mean we can't strive for objectivity and fairness in our own thinking.
Right. Being open to new information and
Yeah.
being willing to, admit when we're wrong, change our minds when there's good reason to.
I think you're right on the money there, embracing that intellectual humility, recognizing that nobody has all the answers. We all have things to learn from other people, even those we might disagree with.
Yeah, and that's what makes learning so cool, right? It's this lifelong journey of discovery, and there's always more to learn.
Absolutely. But that journey, it requires us to step outside our comfort zones a little bit, engage with the world, with all its messiness and complexity.
It's about embracing the nuance,
Yeah.
right? Understanding that the truth is usually complicated, and there isn't always a simple answer. And being okay with that ambiguity, knowing that learning is a process that never really ends.
And I think that's a much more rewarding approach,
Yeah.
intellectually honest than just clinging to easy answers and simple narratives. So where do we go from here? What are some actual steps we can take to become more discerning about the information we consume and break out of those echo chambers that try to trap us in our own little worlds?
That's the question, isn't it? What can we actually do? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, I think it starts with diversifying our media diets. We shouldn't just rely on one source for news and information. We should actively look for different perspectives, including ones that challenge our views.
Like cross-training for your mind, right?
Yeah.
Expose yourself to different viewpoints, different styles of reporting, different ways of, framing an issue.
Yeah, exactly. And, beyond just reading different sources, I think it's super important to actually pay attention to where our information is coming from. Who's funding the research? What are their motivations? Are they transparent about their methods, their potential biases? These are all questions we should be asking.
It's about being more discerning, right? Not just taking everything at face value.
Yeah.
Thinking about the context, the agendas, the possibility of manipulation.
For sure. And don't forget about fact-checking. There are so many great resources out there now to help us figure out what's true and what's not. Websites like Snopes, PolitiFact, they can be really useful, especially when you see those crazy claims that go viral online.
Yeah, those sites have definitely saved me from sharing some questionable stuff before.
I hear that. And beyond those online tools, don't discount good old-fashioned research. If something sounds too good to be true or just too crazy to believe, dig a little deeper, Look for credible sources, experts, peer-reviewed research. Google Scholar is a great place to start.
Yeah, go beyond the headlines, beyond the clickbait, and actually get into the substance of the issue. And like you said before, critical thinking isn't just about being skeptical. It's also about being open to changing your mind, right? When you see good evidence.
You're absolutely right. It's about that intellectual humility again, recognizing that we all have those blind spots, The goal isn't to always be right, but to always be learning, always be growing, and that means engaging with different viewpoints, even the ones that make us uncomfortable.
Right. Because disagreement can actually help us learn and grow. Sometimes a good intellectual sparring match can actually help you understand an issue better.
I totally agree. And I think that's what makes this whole exploration of media bias so interesting. It's not just about pointing fingers. It's about finding solutions and figuring out how we can be better, more informed citizens.
It's about realizing that we all have a role to play in shaping the information landscape and that our choices matter.
Yeah, we can demand better from our media, hold them accountable for accuracy and fairness, and support journalism that's actually trying to serve the public good.
It's about taking back some control. In the face of all this information overload and manipulation. Because a healthy democracy needs citizens who are informed and engaged.
I couldn't agree more.
So how do we move from awareness to action? What can we actually do to support good journalism and help create a more, informed public discourse?
Well, for starters, we can actually support journalism financially. Subscriptions, donations, even just sharing articles from reputable sources, all that stuff helps.
Because that financial stability, that's what allows journalists to do their jobs properly, right? Without having to worry about pleasing, special interests or political pressure.
Exactly. And beyond financial support, we can, talk about these issues, share articles we think are important, challenge misinformation when we see it, and have those tough conversations with people who see things differently.
Because ultimately, we all benefit from a more informed society.
Right.
And we can all contribute to that goal.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, this has been a really great conversation. We've covered a lot, from the history of media bias research to the challenges of social media and the importance of critical thinking.
Yeah, it's been great. We've talked about what individuals can do, how we can all be more informed and engaged.
But before we move on, I want to leave you with something to think about, a little thought experiment as we head into the last part of our deep dive.
I always love a good thought experiment. What you got?
Okay, imagine a world where news organizations had to, like, disclose their funding sources and their potential biases up front.
Hmm.
Like how food labels list all the nutritional content,
Interesting.
Would that actually make us more aware? Or would it just make people more skeptical of everything?
That's a good question. Really makes you think about like transparency, trust, and what the role of media should be in a democracy.
Yeah, definitely a lot to unpack there. And we're going to get into all that in the last part of our deep dive, so stick around. All right, so we're back. And, I've been thinking about that question we left off with, that whole idea of like, news sources having to label their biases, kind of like nutrition labels on food. Would that actually like change anything?
Yeah, it's a really interesting thought, right? Like at first glance, it seems like, yeah, maybe more transparency would be good, help people, make better decisions about where they're getting their news from.
Right, because if you know that, like, I don't know, a certain outlet is funded by, say, like a big oil company, you'd probably be a little more skeptical of their reporting on climate change, right?
Exactly. But applying that same logic to news, it's a little trickier, Because news isn't supposed to be about like pushing a product or a specific agenda. It's about informing the public, holding those in power accountable.
Right, right. And I could see those labels, even if they're supposed to be about transparency,
Mm-hmm.
I could see them actually backfiring. Just making people more distrustful of the media in general.
Oh, yeah. That's a huge risk. People who are already, like, skeptical of the media, they might see those labels as proof that, everything is biased, even if the reporting itself is totally fair and accurate. It could just push people further into those echo chambers, make them even less likely to consider different perspectives.
Like, you can give people all the information in the world.
Right.
You can't make them think critically about it, right?
Exactly. And that brings us back to like, the whole critical thinking thing, which has kind of been the theme of our deep dive here. It's not enough to just be skeptical of information. You have to be able to actually evaluate it, consider different angles, and form your own, informed opinions.
Right. It's about being like an active participant in this whole information ecosystem, not just passively absorbing whatever comes across your screen, and realizing that we all have a responsibility to be informed, to be engaged citizens. And that's about way more than just reading the news.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's about supporting quality journalism, holding our leaders accountable, having those tough conversations, and just generally promoting a culture of critical thinking.
And realizing that a healthy democracy actually needs a free and independent press.
Yeah.
And it needs citizens who are, informed, engaged, and actually care about the truth, even when it's complicated and messy.
Couldn't have said it better myself. I think those are like the big takeaways from our exploration of media bias.
Yeah, totally. We've looked at the history, how it affects us, all the challenges we face in this, crazy media landscape we live in. We talked about some ways to be smarter about the information we consume, diversifying our media diets, all that, and how important it is to think critically about everything.
And that we all have a part to play in this, in making the information ecosystem better and creating a more informed public.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But before we wrap things up, I want to leave you with one last thought, something to kind of chew on as you go out into the world and continue to navigate all this.
Sounds good. Lay it on me.
Okay, so think about this. What can you do to be a more active and informed participant in this whole information landscape? How can you support quality journalism, encourage critical thinking, and help create a more, nuanced and productive public discourse?
Those are great questions, and they're not easy to answer.
Nope. But they're worth thinking about. Because the answers, they're going to shape the future of our media, our democracy, and how we understand the world around us. So, yeah, I think that's a good place to leave it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We hope you found it, informative and maybe even a little bit inspiring.
Yeah, it's been fun. Keep those critical thinking skills sharp and never stop questioning, exploring, learning new things.
Until next time, happy diving.